Picture a man stepping off a carriage in a strange city, in a country where he knows no one. He has almost no money in his pocket. He has no real plan. And yet, by the end of the week, he will be dining with counts, charming duchesses, winning at the card tables, and somehow convincing the most powerful people in town that he is exactly the sort of man that they have always wanted to meet. How? He has no army, no fortune, no famous family name. His only weapons are a quick mind, a silver tongue, and an absolutely unshakable belief that everything will work out, because, somehow, it usually does. His name is Giacomo Casanova, and he is, without question, one of the most entertaining characters the 18th century ever produced. We remember the name today as a kind of legend, almost a word in itself. But the real man was far more interesting than the legend, because Casanova was not simply a charmer. He was an adventurer in the truest sense, a gambler, an escape artist, a spy of sorts, a writer, a wanderer who crossed and recrossed an entire continent, talking his way into palaces and out of prisons, always one clever sentence ahead of disaster. He was born in Venice in 1725, in a city that was, at the time, the great pleasure capital of Europe. And what a city it was to be born into! Venice, in those years, was a place unlike anywhere else on earth. A city built on water, threaded with canals instead of streets, where gondolas glided through the mist and music drifted from lighted windows late into the night. It was a city of masks and gambling houses, of grand carnivals that ran for weeks, where for a season anyone could hide their face behind a mask and become, for a little while, whoever they wished to be. Nobles and beggars, saints and swindlers, all mingled together behind painted disguises. It was, in other words, the perfect place to raise a boy who would spend his entire life turning himself into whoever he needed to be. His parents were actors, often away on tour, and the young Giacomo was a sickly child, frequently ill, left largely in the care of his grandmother. He was not expected to amount to much, but he had one extraordinary gift that revealed itself early, an astonishing mind. He devoured books. He remembered everything. He entered university as a boy of 12 and walked out with a law degree before most children today finish school. And yet, the law bored him to tears. So did every respectable path anyone tried to set him on. They tried to make him a priest. They tried to make him a soldier. They tried to make him a violinist. He tried each of them on like a coat, wore it for a while, and then walked away. Because Giacomo Casanova had already discovered the single great truth that would shape his entire life. He was never going to fit into the small box the world had built for him. He was going to talk, charm, gamble, and improvise his way into a far larger life than anyone had imagined for him. The only question was how far that life would take him. And the answer, it turned out, was very far indeed. To understand Casanova, you have to understand his greatest talent, and it was not romance, whatever the legend says. It was reinvention. Casanova could walk into a room and become whatever that room required. A scholar among scholars, a soldier among soldiers, a mystic among the superstitious, a wit among the clever, and a sympathetic ear among the lonely. He had read enough, seen enough, and remembered enough that he could hold his own in almost any conversation on almost any subject with almost anyone. And so he collected patrons the way other men collected debts. Again and again throughout his life, Casanova would arrive somewhere with nothing, attach himself to a wealthy and powerful protector, and live like a gentleman on someone else's money. His first great stroke of luck came in Venice, and the story is pure Casanova. He happened to be sharing a gondola with an elderly Venetian nobleman when the old man suffered a sudden stroke. In the panic that followed, the doctors did what doctors did in those days, which, frankly, often made things worse. Casanova, who had read a great deal about medicine and was never shy about offering an opinion, stepped in, overruled the physicians, and insisted on a simpler treatment. The nobleman recovered. Now, did Casanova actually save his life? Perhaps, perhaps not. But the old man and his friends became convinced that this charming young stranger possessed some special, almost mystical wisdom. They took him into their household and supported him for years. And Casanova, never one to waste an opportunity, happily played the role of the brilliant young sage they wanted him to be. This was the pattern of his entire life. He understood something that most people never learn, that the world often rewards confidence and performance just as much as substance. People wanted to believe in something marvelous. Casanova was always delighted to be that marvelous thing. He even dabbled in what we might politely call magic. He let wealthy nobles believe he had occult powers, that he understood secret numbers and hidden forces, that he could commune with mysteries beyond ordinary understanding. He joined secret societies. He spoke knowingly of alchemy and the search for ways to turn ordinary metal into gold. Much of it was theater, and he knew it. As he once cheerfully admitted, fooling a fool was, in his view, a perfectly respectable achievement for a clever man. And then, of course, there were the cards. Gambling ran through Casanova's life like a bright, dangerous thread. He played everything the age had to offer in the candlelit gaming rooms where fortunes changed hands in a single evening, and a cool head was worth more than any fortune. For Casanova, gambling was not merely a vice, it was a stage, another place to perform, to read his opponents, to bluff and charm and calculate. On a good night, he could win enough to live like a prince for months. On a bad night, he could lose everything he owned by dawn. He knew both nights intimately, and he kept coming back to the table anyway, because the thrill of the gamble was, in a sense, the thrill of his whole life in miniature. It would be easy to call him a con man, and sometimes he certainly was one. But there was something almost joyful in the way he did it, a performer's delight in the show itself. He was not a cold swindler hiding in the shadows. He was a man enjoying the enormous game of his own life, playing every role with gusto, and somehow charming even the people he tricked. And for a while, it all worked beautifully. But Venice, the city that had made him, was also watching him, and it was beginning to decide that Giacomo Casanova had become a little too clever for his own good. For all his charm, Casanova had a gift for making enemies almost as easily as he made friends. He was reckless, he was provocative, he played elaborate practical jokes that sometimes went much too far. He gambled openly, argued with the wrong people, mocked things that powerful men took very seriously, and generally behaved as though the rules that bound everyone else simply did not apply to him. In most cities, this would earn you a bad reputation. In Venice, it could earn you something far worse. Because beneath all the masks and carnival glamour, Venice was governed by a secretive and powerful state, one that prided itself on knowing everything that happened within its canals. The same city that let people hide behind masks was, in truth, always watching what they did behind them. A network of informers and spies kept careful track of troublemakers, and slowly, quietly, a file on Casanova grew thicker and thicker. Reports of his behavior, his scandals, his suspicious interest in forbidden books and secret societies, all piling up in the hands of men who did not find him nearly as charming as the duchesses did. His own protector, an old and well-connected friend who had once been part of that very system of state power, warned him plainly, leave the city now or face serious consequences. Casanova, being Casanova, laughed it off. Surely his wit and his charm would protect him as they always had. They did not. In the summer of 1755, when he was 30 years old, the authorities came for him. He was arrested without warning, given no trial, and not even told exactly what he had done wrong. He was simply marched away and locked up, and not in any ordinary jail. They put him in a prison known as the Leads. It was called that because it sat directly beneath the lead-tiled roof of the great Doge's palace, in the very heart of Venice. The cells were reserved for special prisoners, and they were designed to be inescapable. In summer, the lead roof turned the cells into ovens. In the worst of them, the heat was almost unbearable. The conditions were miserable, the isolation crushing, and worst of all, the sentence stretched out before him with no clear end. For a man like Casanova, a man who could not bear to stay still, who needed conversation and movement and the open road the way other people need air, it was a special kind of nightmare. He was 30 years old, brilliant, restless, full of life, and locked inside a stone box on top of a palace with the whole of Europe waiting beyond the walls. Most prisoners in his position would have despaired, or waited, or hoped for mercy. Casanova decided he would simply leave. And what he did next would become the single most famous story of his entire extraordinary life. No one had ever escaped from the Leads. The whole point of the place was that escape was impossible. But Casanova was not most prisoners. He began the way he began everything, by paying close attention. He studied the prison. He studied his cell. He studied the routines of the guards and the structure of the building above and below him. And during the exercise time he was occasionally allowed, he found something useful: a discarded iron bar and a piece of hard black stone. He smuggled them back to his cell and hid the iron bar inside his armchair. Then, in secret, during the long hours when he had no cellmate to betray him, he spent weeks slowly grinding that iron bar against the stone, sharpening it into a crude spike. It was patient, exhausting, dangerous work. Exactly the kind of long-game cleverness that the legend of the smooth-talking charmer tends to leave out. The man could talk his way through any door, yes, but when talking failed, he could also sit alone in the dark and grind metal against stone for weeks without losing his nerve. His first plan was to dig down through the floor of his cell. He had nearly finished. And then, just days before he meant to make his move, the guards abruptly transferred him to a different cell. All those weeks of work gone in an instant. For most people, that would have been the end of hope. For Casanova, it was simply a reason to come up with a better plan. This time, he recruited a partner, a monk imprisoned in a neighboring cell. Casanova couldn't carry the spike to his accomplice openly, so he hid it inside a large book and had the unsuspecting guard deliver the book, buried beneath a heaping plate of pasta so that no one would think to look underneath. It worked perfectly. The monk used the tool to break through his own ceiling, climbed across the hidden space above the cells, and broke down into Casanova's cell from above. And then, in the dark, the two men climbed up and out onto the roof of the Doge's palace itself. Imagine the scene, the middle of the night, a thick fog hanging over Venice. Two escaped prisoners crawling across the steep, slippery, lead-covered roof of one of the most important buildings in the city, high above the canals, with nothing but mist and a long fall beneath them. One wrong movement on those slick tiles would have ended everything. Casanova had brought along a length of bedsheet knotted into a makeshift rope. Using it, and a ladder they found on the roof, they lowered themselves through a window back into the palace. But they weren't free yet. They were now inside the very building they'd escaped from, in the dark, surrounded by locked doors. So Casanova did the most Casanova thing imaginable. When morning came and a guard spotted them, Casanova didn't run or panic. He simply acted as though he belonged there, as though he were an important official who had been accidentally locked inside the palace overnight after some grand event. He straightened his clothes, lifted his chin, and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had every right to be exactly where he was. He was so calm, so utterly convincing that the bewildered guard actually unlocked the doors and let them walk straight out. They strolled out the front, stepped into a waiting gondola, and glided away across the water as the city woke around them. It was, in a way, the perfect summary of the entire man. He had escaped the leads not through one single trick, but through all of his talents at once: patience, planning, nerve, raw physical courage, and finally, when it mattered most, the sheer brazen confidence to talk his way past the last guard. He had done the impossible, and he would spend the rest of his life, quite rightly, telling absolutely everyone about it. The escape made Casanova a celebrity, and it launched most spectacular phase of his life. Decades of wandering across Europe, rising and falling, winning and losing, again and again and again. He fled first to Paris, and there he pulled off perhaps his single greatest financial triumph. The French government wanted to raise money, and Casanova helped set up and promote a national lottery. He threw himself into selling tickets with all his charm and energy, and almost overnight he became genuinely enormously rich. For once in his life, the gambler had the whole house on his side. And here is the thing about Casanova that makes him so endlessly entertaining. He could make a fortune like that, and then lose every penny of it just as fast. He poured money into a silk business and ran it into the ground. He gambled, he spent wildly, lived extravagantly, chased one grand scheme after another. Money for Casanova was never something to keep. It was something to spend, to enjoy, to throw at the next adventure. The French government was so impressed with his talents that they actually offered him a title and a comfortable pension if he would settle down and work for them. A steady life, security, respectability. He turned it down. Of course he did. Settling down was the one thing Giacomo Casanova could never do. So instead, he wandered. And what a wandering it was. Over the years, he crossed nearly the whole of Europe: Paris, Amsterdam, Cologne, Geneva, Rome, Naples, Florence, Vienna, and on and on. He sold government bonds in the financial heart of the continent and proved a surprisingly shrewd negotiator. He carried out a delicate spying mission and was paid handsomely for it. He had no fixed home, no fixed fortune, no fixed identity. He simply moved, endlessly, reinventing himself in each new city, living by his wits and his charm and his astonishing luck. What is perhaps most remarkable about all this wandering is the company Casanova kept. This was not a man lurking only in gambling dens and back rooms. He moved, somehow, through the very center of his century. He sat and talked with Voltaire, the most famous thinker in Europe, and held his own discussing literature and philosophy with him. He passed through the dazzling courts of kings and empresses, was received by the Pope, who decorated the perpetually broke adventurer with an honor, giving him a glittering cross to wear proudly on his chest, and brushed up against the great salons where the bold new ideas that would soon shake Europe were taking shape, and the world of music that produced men like Mozart. Think about what that means. A penniless actor's son from Venice, with no title and no fortune, had made himself into a man who could sit at the same table as the most powerful and brilliant people alive. He had no right to be in those rooms, and yet there he was, again and again, welcomed, listened to, remembered. It is one thing to charm a card table, it is another thing entirely to charm an age. And in his strange, restless way, that is exactly what Casanova managed to do. But luck, as every gambler eventually learns, has a way of running out. The schemes grew thinner, the patrons grew fewer. The fortunes he won slipped through his fingers faster than he could replace them. He was thrown into debtor's prison more than once. He was expelled from cities, asked politely, and sometimes not so politely, to move along. The same restless energy that had carried him to such dizzying heights now carried him from place to place with diminishing returns. The world itself was changing, growing more orderly and more cautious, less patient with charming adventurers who lived on nothing but wit and nerve. And the years, too, were doing their quiet work. The dazzling young man who had once talked his way past a palace guard was growing older, his charm a little more worn, his welcome in each new city a little shorter than the last. And slowly, the great performer began to realize that the longest performance of all, youth, charm, momentum, luck, was finally drawing toward its close. The final act of Casanova's life is, in its own way, the most surprising of all. The great wanderer, the man who could not bear to sit still, ended his days in a quiet castle in the countryside of Bohemia, far from Paris and Venice and all the glittering cities of his adventures. He took a job as a librarian for a wealthy count, a calm, respectable, almost sleepy position for a man who had once escaped across the rooftops of Venice in the fog. You might think this would be a sad ending. An aging adventurer, his fortunes spent, his great escapes behind him, shelving books in a remote castle, while the world that had once delighted in him moved on without him. And there were certainly lonely, bittersweet years in that library. The travel was over. The card tables were far away. The famous charm now fell mostly on the ears of household servants who did not always know quite what to make of the strange, proud old gentleman among the books. But Casanova had one last trick left, and it turned out to be the greatest of them all. In those quiet years, with little else to do, he sat down and began to write. He wrote the story of his own life, the whole sprawling, improbable, scandalous, hilarious adventure of it. The escapes and the schemes, the fortunes and the disasters, the famous people and the strange cities, the triumphs and the foolishness, all set down in his own vivid, charming, utterly unembarrassed voice. And in doing so, he accomplished something no card game or lottery or clever scheme had ever quite managed. He made himself immortal. Because that manuscript, the memoir of a restless adventurer scribbling away in a faraway library, became one of the most remarkable documents of the entire 18th century. Through Casanova's eyes, we can still walk the streets of old Venice, sit at the gaming tables of Paris, climb across the rooftops of the Doge's palace, and meet the philosophers and nobles and rogues of a vanished world. He had spent his whole life as a performer in search of an audience. In the end, he found the largest audience imaginable, readers, centuries later, in languages he never spoke, still turning his pages. And here's the part that historians treasure most. Casanova did not only write about himself. In writing his own life, he accidentally preserved his entire world. Because he had been everywhere and met everyone, his memoir became a window into the 18th century like almost no other. The way people traveled and dressed and gambled, the way they talked in the great salons, the food, the manners, the superstitions, the scandals, the small details of daily life that official histories almost never record. Kings and battles are easy to find in old documents, but the living texture of an age, what it actually felt like to be alive then, is far harder to capture. Casanova, almost without meaning to, captured it. The very restlessness that made him such a difficult man to trust in life made him the perfect witness to his century. He had seen all of it, and he wrote it exactly as he remembered it, vivid and unashamed. So what do we make of Giacomo Casanova? He was, by any honest measure, often unreliable, frequently broke, occasionally a fraud, and forever unable to hold on to anything: money, position, or peace. He built nothing that lasted in the ordinary sense. He left no empire, no fortune, no great institution. And yet there is something undeniably wonderful about him. Here was a man who, with no advantages but his own wit and nerve, simply refused to accept the small life the world had assigned. He talked his way into palaces and out of prisons. He turned himself into whoever he needed to be. He chased every door that opened in front of him, and when there was no door, he made one, even if it meant climbing out across a rooftop in the fog. He reminds us, perhaps, that a life does not have to be tidy to be extraordinary. The charm and curiosity and sheer audacity can carry a person astonishingly far, and that sometimes The greatest escape of all is simply refusing to be ordinary. The card tables are silent now. The gondolas have drifted away. But somewhere in the pages he left behind, Giacomo Casanova is still talking, still charming, still slipping out the front door with a confident smile, forever one clever sentence ahead of the world.